Good morning, everyone. Good morning online. If you have your Bible, you can go ahead and open, if you would, to Daniel chapter 2. I don't know what your experience with dreams is, but I find that my own dreams, when I remember them, are pretty ridiculous. Crazy. It makes sense when you're dreaming, and then you wake up, and if you remember it, you go, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There are people who try to interpret dreams, and there's a whole branch of spirituality focused on that, and my comment about that is that's either daft or demonic, so it's just stay away from that. It doesn't make any sense. But there's another level at which God sometimes does communicate, can communicate, and he's used dreams in the past. I remember we had a number of trips that we took to India where we were in a church planting partnership with a group there, the Vishnupriya people, and they found it really helpful for us to come, and we'd go from hut to hut in the villages. It was a pretty rural area. And just share the gospel. People were interested, they would listen, sometimes they would respond, sometimes they would want to know more. Our Vishnupriya partners would then follow up and organize churches and answer questions, and it was a really fruitful ministry. One of the things that was, at least occasionally, a part of that ministry were dreams. One time, one of our team members went to a hut, and the guy in there welcomed them in with enthusiasm because he'd had a dream. And he said, I had a dream last night. I think it was from God. And God said somebody would be coming from far away to tell me something very important from him. And then his countenance changed a little bit, and he looked around and he said, but I guess that's not you, because that was one person God was talking about who had come from far away, and there are two of you. And in a moment of insight, the guy from our team said, well, yeah, we're here to tell you about the one person God sent from far away with a message from him. And the gospel opened up, and by the time they were done sharing, this man had the Spirit had worked in his heart, and he just came to faith in Christ. And that dream that he had was integral to God's work in bringing him to faith. One time I was visiting, and it was a little bit bigger place. It was actually a house and had a tin roof, and it was for the villages that we were in. It was a pretty nice place. And a lot of the people we visited had not really heard of Jesus or heard much about him, if at all. But this house we went to, they were well-versed in the gospel and had repeatedly rejected. The reason I knew that is because my translator, the one that I was going with, it was his sister's house. And she and he had been in dialogue for years since he'd been a believer, and she had just kept rejecting it. But when the Americans were showing up, she, of course, I'll bring them and we'll talk and whatever. So when I got into the room there and we sat down, she and her husband, my translator and I, before I could say much of anything, she said, I had a dream last night, and I think it was about Jesus. And in this dream, there were people from all over the world, all kinds of ethnicities, all kinds of regions, all kinds of backgrounds, and they were all bowing down to a baby that was in the middle. And I think maybe that was about Jesus. And I said, well, I think so too. And I opened my Bible to Revelation chapter 7, where people from every nation, tribe, and tongue are gathered around to worship the Lamb of God. Talked about that, then from there went into the gospel and just kind of walked through everything again. And when that kind of came to its conclusion, before there could be any further conversation, she could ask a question or say anything before I could ask a question or say anything, a tropical rainstorm broke, and every ounce of water that was in the clouds fell down on the tin roof of that house for the next 15 minutes. And if you've never had that experience, it is thunderous, right? You can go to a rock concert, literally, and hear better than you could in that house. We were 4 feet apart, 5 feet apart, and you could shout, and all you could see were lips moving. So we had to sit there for 15 minutes as this water is just pounding down. But the last thing that we talked about is, I think God did give you a dream. I think this is what it is, and this is the gospel. And that whole time, she and her husband just had to sit there thinking about that. And when the thunderstorm stopped, they were ready. And they just said, yeah, we believe. And we told them a little bit more, and they prayed and accepted Christ right there on the spot. And it was fundamental to that process was a dream that God had given that when they understood it, it opened their eyes. Now, God certainly doesn't always work that way, but he has worked that way at times, and that's what this chapter is about this morning. God is giving a dream to Nebuchadnezzar, and he's giving him a dream in order to kind of bring him into what God is doing and give Nebuchadnezzar an opportunity to realign himself. The opening section of Daniel is kind of this contest between God and people, the rulers and the hubris of humanity. And the question that is asked of us as readers is, whose team are we going to be on? But it's also asked of the characters, right? Nebuchadnezzar, are you going to be on your own team or are you going to be on God's team? You need to understand what God is doing. You need to understand these things that you think about yourself that seem so intuitively obvious are actually not true. And here's what God is doing. Here's who God is. And how are you going to respond to that? So God gives him a dream. And in the interpretation of that dream, then Nebuchadnezzar does move. He doesn't move all the way to being a follower of God, but it does shift him a bit. And God is at work in that. It's a long chapter. We're going to read the entire chapter. It is a story, so it's pretty easy to track with. I will only make a few comments because the story itself is not complicated to understand. We'll unpack a few key things in there, and then we'll talk about some implications for us today. In this series, we're reminding ourselves that you and I, as followers of Jesus, are exiles in this world. We are a different order of person is what God is looking for, what God is creating in us, and yet we live in this world. How do we do that well? We can't just withdraw. That doesn't make any sense. We can't capitulate and just become part of the world system around us. How do we live as distinct people and yet live fully engaged and fully involved, but not entangled? So how do we flourish while in exile is the fundamental question. And this passage will give us some real help with that. One more thing before we dive into it. Most of the things we want to talk about will be pretty easy for you to see looking backwards, but let me point out one thing that can get overlooked. As we're reading through this, look at the theme of revelation or mystery or secret or, look for those kinds of words, right? Or those kinds of ideas, because that's central to this passage, and I want to make sure that registers with us as we're going through it as well. So if you want to follow along, if you've never read this fascinating chapter, and I think you will find it quite wild and interesting. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, let me stop there for just 1 second. If you weren't here last week, let me just tell you two quick things. The book of Daniel has a dual structure to really bring out its point. The first 6 chapters are historical narratives, court narratives. They're like stories, which is why they're fun to read and easy to follow for the most part. The second 6 chapters, 7 through 12, are apocalyptic visions, which means they're amazing, they're fascinating, but they're very bizarre and they're hard to understand, right? So the book just naturally breaks that way, and there's a couple of themes that track with that. Then also overlaid on that, there's a language kind of distinction that is made, and Daniel writes chapter 1 in Hebrew, chapter 8 through 12 in Hebrew. That was the mother tongue of the Jewish people. And the focus of those, especially 8 through 12, seems to be on what is God doing in terms of his covenant and his covenant relationship with his people and those kinds of questions. Chapter 2, starting with the word I'm about to read, verse 4, second half, switches to Aramaic, and it stays in Aramaic all the way through the end of chapter 7. Aramaic was the common language that was used throughout the world. It was like the English, if you will, of its day, that all educated people and all government people and everyone knew, because that's how they were going to communicate with each other. It's unusual that Daniel would write in that. It tells us, it points us to the fact that a lot of this has to do with history in the larger context in the whole world. And it also helps us to see something he wants us to key into. He set these chapters, 2 through 7, up as a matching parallel set. Chapter 2 is to be read with chapter 7. Chapter 3 is to be read with chapter 6. Chapter 4 is to be read with chapter 5. And each of those pairs has a major theme that's reinforced. And so it would be obvious reading them, that theme, but by setting it up this way, Daniel is putting a huge spotlight on it, saying, really focus on these themes as you go through this. Okay, so what I'm about to read starts that shift. And chapter 2, as we begin to unpack it, we won't read chapter 7, but we'll read this in comparison with chapter 7. It'll help us to understand key point. Okay, so the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, quote, here's where Aramaic starts, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation." They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who'd gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Okay, let's stop there for a moment, make sure we're on the same page here. Nebuchadnezzar is a brand new emperor. He becomes emperor. Basically, he's out conquering the world. He crushes the Assyrian Empire. He beats Egypt back into its borders and just totally dominates them, takes over everything. And during that campaign, his father dies, and then he ascends to the throne. So he's a brand new king. In chapter 1, we see Daniel and his friends are captives that are supposed to go to Nebuchadnezzar U. In Nebuchadnezzar University, learn all the stuff of Babylon, all the Chaldean literature and language and so on. That's a 3-year course. This says it's during the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which means one of two things, right? The way they would use time markers is a little different than us. It is either, one way of reading it that would be legitimate, either Daniel and his friends are still at Neb U studying, or it seems more likely from the way the story unfolds, they've just graduated, just gotten their official diploma as wise man of Babylon, just in time to have their heads taken off. And Nebuchadnezzar, as a new reigning emperor, though he's a powerful ruler beyond our imaginings, is also vulnerable. The transition time of the empire would be the time that's most vulnerable, and that would be when people would be plotting, we don't want you to be the king, your dad's gone, we can take over, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar is worried about that as well, and that shows up in his interaction with the Chaldeans, with the astrologers, right? He's not just being a despotic jerk, although he is that. He's also very concerned, and so it's easy enough for them to say, oh, you tell us the dream, here's what it means, O king. They've got books to refer to and different things that they can do to kind of figure that out. But how does he know? How does he know if they're telling him the truth? And by the way, the dream itself that he's had is a little bit disturbing until you understand it. So what's going on? Maybe there's a plot against my life. Maybe you guys are part of that. right? I want you to tell me what the dream is and then tell me what it means, and that'll be the test of loyalty and the test of my confidence that, yes, you actually know what you're talking about. And so when they're hemming and hawing, which makes sense, no king actually would ask for what he asked for. He is being unreasonable and unfair. They're like, you can't do that. He says, I sure can. Watch me. But when they are hemming and hawing, he says, I knew it. You guys are out to get me. You're just withholding this from me. You're waiting until everything changes and the empire falls into other hands, and then you'll do your stuff. I'm not going to play that game. You either tell me or I'm going to have you ripped apart and your houses destroyed. That's what's gone on so far. And when they show up at Daniel's door, it's the executioner knocking on the door, ready to take his head off with everyone else. But Daniel slows it down. He says, whoa, wait, hold on. There's a way for the king to be answered. And he goes into the king and he says, when do you want me to answer this? Give me a little space and then I'll come back and tell you. And he's looking to God, right? The Chaldeans, the astrologers, the magicians, all the different kind of fortune teller people said to Nebuchadnezzar, nobody can answer your question because only the gods know that. And they're not actually that concerned about the affairs of humanity. Right? They're off doing their thing, and we're just got to make this on our own, and yeah, there's no way you're going to get your answer. Daniel comes back and says, oh, no. There is a God who is able to answer. Let me talk to him and see what he says. Okay, let's move on. Verse 17, Daniel went to the house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. Those are better known actually by their Babylonian names. Those are the Hebrew names. We know them more commonly as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he says to them, seek the mercy from God, from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and Daniel answered and said, and then this is the prayer that Derek shared with us earlier, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might. You have made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise man, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Okay, now before we get into the actual dream, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. He goes in before the king. The king says, can you really do it? And he says, well, yes and no. Nobody can do it. And I'm not all that special either, but God can and has done it because he wants you to know. He gave you the dream, and now he's giving the interpretation because he's bringing you into what he's doing. He wants you to understand. So now I'll tell you what it is. But don't think anything great of me. It's God. Okay? Keep going. Verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. The image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation true. All right, let's stop for a minute and catch up again. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of this huge statue of a man, gold, silver, bronze, iron, and eventually mingled with clay. And Daniel says, this is what God is showing you. You're the guy that's the gold head, but there's going to be a succession of kingdoms, a succession of empires really in this world, and God is going to set them up and take them down. He's the one that made you who you are. One day he's going to make somebody else that, and one day he's going to make somebody else that, one day he's going to make somebody else that. But in the end, his kingdom, which is not formed by humans but comes from God, is going to come in and crush everything and completely take over because God is the one who is in complete control. That's the dream. That's what God wants you to know. Now, as we look at this passage, let me just unpack a couple of things here real quickly. There's this succession of kingdoms, and one of the questions that people will often ask is, so what are they? We know the first one is Nebuchadnezzar. How does it flow from there? And the reality is there's actually a fair amount of debate. There's two main views on which those kingdoms are, and I will give you in this moment the definitive answer. Okay? And there's no qualifier on that. I really mean that. I will give you the definitive answer. The answer is we don't know. We don't know. God does not tell us. And this chapter is not designed to unpack that in any kind of detail. When we get to chapter 7, we'll get some more detail. When we get into 8 and 10 and 11, there's more detail that becomes more obvious. But in this chapter, he's not focused on telling us all of those details. And so we've got to curb our curiosity a bit. Right? And we don't have to try to figure out what the 10 toes mean. They don't mean anything. They mean toes. Right? Later on, there's 10 horns and a beast in chapter 7, and those are called out. They're focused on. That's when we start looking at that. Now, it would be naive to not just say, well, but we can probably understand a little bit about what's going on here based on the greater book, and that's true enough. The two main views are this. Either it's basically Babylon, followed by Medo-Persia, followed by Greece, followed by Rome, and Rome is that iron kingdom that is then compromised and Ultimately, in some way, Rome is in power when the kingdom of God takes over. That's actually the view I would gravitate towards, probably the view most of us have heard taught, if that's what we're listening to. The other view is, there's some challenges with that, like how is Persia actually weaker than Babylon? Because we know that's not true. It doesn't actually say weaker. It does say not as great. But it's like, okay. With that view, it would be Babylon, then Media, then Persia, then Greece. Right? And there's arguments over that, and we'll get into some of that when we get later in the book, but we're really going to focus on what Daniel's trying to teach us here and not just try to get all of our questions answered. In this moment, for this morning, whatever those kingdoms are, there's this picture that says God is in control. Nebuchadnezzar, he's the one who gave you the power that you've got, and you're the gold head. And then sometime later, that's going to be replaced. Another empire, another empire, another empire. All the machinations of human life, there's God behind it anyway. And then in the end, he's going to break forth into the front and center of the scene, and his kingdom's going to come and crush and take over. And that's what he wants us to get from this. All right, so let's just finish off this last little bit real quick. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. Now, that's a troubling verse. When we think of other verses in Scripture, we find John, for instance, falling down before an angel to worship, and the angel's like, dude, get up, don't do that. No, not me. I'm not the one. Or Paul and Barnabas on their missionary journey, they do some great things, and people go, oh, it's the gods, they've come among us, and they try to make a sacrifice. And like, no, don't do that. Don't worship us. And here we have Nebuchadnezzar falling down in front of Daniel, and Daniel doesn't stop him. What does that mean? Well, if we read the next verse, that helps us. Nebuchadnezzar is not worshiping Daniel. He's worshiping Daniel's God. Daniel is there, and he's the representative of God in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, which is still poor form of worship. But God is not dealing with Nebuchadnezzar on that question at the moment, so just lets it ride. But look at how it unfolds. So Nebuchadnezzar is prostrate before Daniel. We won't talk about the other thing. He's maybe an older man, I don't know. Verse 47, the king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods, Lord of kings, revealer of mysteries, for you've been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained at the king's court. Okay, so as the story wraps up, what started off as this horribly terrifying moment actually turns out to move things forward in a really good way. Nebuchadnezzar has shifted. Now, don't read him as coming all the way to be a follower of God here. Remember, he's a polytheist. He's more than happy to bring Yahweh into his pantheon as well. So it's like, oh, your God's pretty good too. He can be part of my gods. The more the merrier. So he's sincere in what he's saying here, but don't read it through our lenses, right? Your God's amazing. I'll worship him. We ought to honor him. We ought to worship him. That's all good. We have many gods. That's not a problem. So he's made some progress, but he's not where he needs to be. And in fact, the next chapter is going to show us he's still way out of line with, do you understand who God is and where you stand before him? Daniel and his friends are now taken out of obscurity, and they're placed in this very significant position. So the way this difficult and terrifying moment turned out actually has furthered God's purposes in a really major way, because Daniel is going to be a key player for 70 years. The entire period of the exile, Daniel's an important player, and he's in an important position. So God's done all that through this. And as the story unfolded, the part that we don't want to miss is the most fundamental thing is it's saying God is the revealer of mysteries. Right? There is a God in heaven who actually cares about what goes on the earth. He's actually involved in what goes on the earth, and he's willing to communicate. He's willing to reveal. He wants to tell. He wants you to know certain things. Nebuchadnezzar, you have this dream. That's from God. He's communicating, and he's going to be revealing mysteries. And over again, in one way or another, that language says God is the revealer of mysteries. But there's a whole lot more in this chapter. And when we read this chapter and all the detail, especially matched up with chapter 7, we also have to latch onto the bigger thing that he's talking about, and that's this. God rules. God is in control. He sets up the kingdoms. He takes down the kingdoms. His kingdom is the ultimate. He's always at work all the time, no matter what it looks like, no matter what you think. God is active and in control. So maybe to put this in language that we can kind of walk with a little bit more, God knows everything, and God is working in everything. God knows everything. God is working in everything. That's the foundation of what this passage shows us. And even we could expand a little bit. God is working in everything because the way the passage unfolds, it shows us he is working at an empire level, right? The grand scheme of everything in history, the things that we feel are so beyond our reach that we sometimes feel like I don't need to worry about them, or we sometimes are afraid because we have no control over them and it's terrifying how it might go. It's like God is in control. He is in control of the empires and he is at work. But God is also in control at a personal level. He's talking personally, in a way, to Nebuchadnezzar. He's working personally in the life of Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Right? So God is always working. He's working at an empire level, but he's also working at a personal level. He's in control. He knows everything. Right? There's nothing in darkness for God. He's never confused. He's never confounded. He's never surprised. He's never wondering. He's never in the dark. He never learns. He knows. He always knows, and he is willing to communicate. He wants to be known. And that God is the one who's in complete control. He's working. Nebuchadnezzar, you have all this power, you have all this pomp and majesty. Nebuchadnezzar is an amazing ruler, one of the great rulers of all of human history. Right, he was a great general, orchestrating the conquest of the Assyrian Empire and takeover of the world. When he became the king, he administrated his kingdom well, and he was a great builder. In fact, people of the ancient world said, if you're only going to do 7 things in your life, you need to be sure and go see Neb's home, because it's amazing. It's like the best of the best. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which he built, those were his. Right, so when Nebuchadnezzar, in a couple of chapters, is walking around kind of arrogant and puffed up, God slaps him down because he is arrogant and puffed up. But in human terms, we go, well, why wouldn't he be? He is the man. You look it up in the dictionary, and there's his picture, the man, Nebuchadnezzar. He did it all. He owns it all. He rules it all. He made it all. He's amazing. And Daniel's saying, whoa. Slow down. You're not seeing things right. You've got presuppositions that need to be corrected by God in his revelation. You have intuitions that are out of alignment, and God needs to correct that. Right, so that's what the chapter's doing. As we look at it and try to say, okay, how does that affect us today? Let's come back to our big idea that this book will help us to flourish living in exile. How does this chapter do that? And I think one of the things that's absolutely foundational to Daniel's ability to make it all 70 years is that he is absolutely anchored in the reality of chapter 2. He's absolutely anchored in the reality of chapter 2. God knows everything. He's never surprised. He's never confounded. God is in complete control. All the time. He's in control at the empire level that I wonder about. He's in control at the personal level when I encounter things that are way over my head. He's in control, and he always knows, and he always works. That truth is one of the key foundation stones to hold life secure. Be able to say, whatever else is going on, however crazy it feels, whatever's going on in the world around me or whatever's going on in my life, God knows, and God is working. He's in control. That's a foundation stone that we can take for our lives. In fact, I would suggest maybe a good way of thinking of it ties in with the story that comes from just a few years ago. Back in World War II, the low point was after Dunkirk, the British had been kicked off the continent. America has not yet jumped in the war. So at least at a fighting level, the UK pretty much literally stands alone. And that's a terrifying place for them. And Churchill's trying to buck them up, and they're doing all the strategic things that they can, but there's also this battle of just not giving up because it's so terrifying. And there's the Ministry of Information puts out a series of slogans to help. There's 3 of them, because now they're afraid, now they know. They know the Blitz is coming, and behind that, if something doesn't change, there will be German boots on British soil. How do we help our people stay anchored? So they had a series of 3 slogans. The 3rd slogan they never actually rolled out, but it's now the most famous. Because in 2000, a bookshop owner, Barter Books in Northumbria, right? You know, here in America, we have boring names like Orange County, Los Angeles County. In the UK, you get to live in Northumbria, right? And there's this bookstore, and he buys this collection of books and stuff, and he's going through a crate. In the bottom, there's a folded up poster, and he pulls it out, looks really cool, shows it to his wife. She thinks, that's really cool, hangs it in their bookstore, and it is a short time after that poster becomes a worldwide phenomenon. There's a picture of a crown, and then a little phrase. It says, some of you can already finish it, right? Be calm and carry on. Be calm and carry on. That never actually got posted very many places. They made 2.5 million of those posters, and they never got to the point where they put most of them up, and then there was a paper shortage, so then they pulped most of them. As far as we know, there may be 16 right now, 15 owned by one family, and then this bookstore guy, maybe some more have surfaced, I don't know. But it created this worldwide phenomena because it just kind of tapped into something. And the irony is that's not what it was supposed to tap into. It was supposed to help during World War II to say, guys, we gotta hold it together here because this is really hard. So hold on, be calm, carry on, right? We understand how those things work, how we can kind of psych ourselves up or put ourselves in a certain frame of reference. Every athlete knows what that means. Every performer knows what that means. Everyone who ever does sales knows what that means, right? There's all these different things. Everyone who's ever had a baby knows that I got to put my mind in a certain place because we're about to go on this roller coaster and it's, whoa, okay, right? We understand that there are times and places where we have to put our thinking in a certain zone to help us with it. Be calm and carry on is what Daniel put center in his mind. God knows everything. God works in everything. Be calm and carry on. Only in that case, it's not just a shift of mindset. The reason it works so profoundly is because it's actually all the way to the bottom true. God absolutely knows, God absolutely works. I can build my life on that. That's true for you and me today too. That's true for you with whatever you're facing, whatever's troubling or disconcerting. Did you notice how when the Arioch shows up at the door, he's knocking on the door, the executioner is there, and Daniel opens the door. How much anxiety do you think there is in the hallways of Babylon's, wise man housing complex? Right? Everyone's freaking out. And Daniel is calm. He answers prudently, and he says, let me pray about this, right? He anchors himself in a different place. Anxiety just is in the system everywhere, right? Fear is in the system everywhere. In our world, right, it drives almost everything. I was at somebody's house a while back, and I walked out of the room, and they were watching a newscast. And I walked out of the room far enough I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the tone. And that was actually what was so striking, because the newscast was clearly calculated to instill fear and to work people up. And that pick your news source. That's not at all uncommon. Pick your social media, your influencer, the messages that are out there. That is so common. We are soaking in a world full of anxiety and fear, and it just can seep into our bones too. Daniel's in this really scary position, and he says, no, no, no. He's able to differentiate. He's able to say, hold on a minute. He's able to pray and trust God because he's anchored in this reality. God knows everything. God works in everything. That's how he's able to be calm and carry on. And that works for me too. I can back away from the panic button. And I can back away from the acrimony and the aggression that go with that same kind of culture, right? Whatever I'm facing on the empire level or on the personal level, God knows and God's working. I can be calm and carry on. That actually frees me then to engage. It doesn't say I just withdraw and hide away. It's like, no, God's in here. God's at work. I can now engage freely because this reality speaks shalom to these narrow shoulders. I don't have to carry the weight of the world. And I am not responsible for the fate of the world. God's got that covered. And that's not just true politically or socially or culturally. That's true in my family. It's true in my neighborhood. That's true in my own soul. Right? If something dramatic is going to happen in me, that is going to be a work of the Spirit of God. I literally cannot make myself grow. There's plenty of things that I can do to be involved in that. But at the end of the day, God has always positioned himself with respect to his children to pick up the heavy end of the load. Daniel just is able to key into that. All right. God knows, God's at work. Be calm and carry on. I was having breakfast with some friends yesterday. Used to be part of the church, and they moved away years ago, and they came over to visit with us, and the wife gave us a book she'd just written. The title was, I'm Glad I Didn't Know. I'm glad I didn't know. And it was all these testimonials about how God is always at work, always knows. But if he'd have told me in advance what that journey might look like, I might have freaked out. But in the end, I see how he worked. Right? There's no guarantees because God is in control that everything's going to be smooth. The people in these stories are tossed into fire. They're tossed to lions. It's the executioner who's knocking on their door. There's no guarantee to us because God is in control that it's going to go smooth. We're told that the suffering of this present time isn't worthy to be compared to the glory that he's working out, 2 Corinthians 4, but that involves suffering, doesn't it? We're told that all things work together for good for God's people, Romans 8. But then it goes on and at one point says, life's hard. We are being put to death every day. But here's what I know. Death, life, principalities, power, nothing is able to separate us from the love of God. He's in control, but the journey can be pretty hard. Ephesians 1 says he is working all things according to the pleasure of his good will. But for you and me, it can be tough. Daniel is anchored in something that helps him even when it's tough. Not just when it's easy. God's in control. God knows. God's working. I may not always understand what he's doing, but he is doing. And as his child, he is doing for my good. At the end of this story, Daniel, now picture this. Let this really sink in. We have literally the most powerful person on the planet, one of the most powerful people who ever walked the planet, lying face down, prostrate at the feet of a Jewish teenage exile. How does that happen? God is at work. God is using this both to humble Nebuchadnezzar and to raise up Daniel for his purposes. God is at work in everything. I need to be calm and carry on. Two more things real quickly. God is revealing mysteries because he wants to be known. And he wants to be known, not just to be known about, but to have relationship and for us to respond. That's how he's working in Nebuchadnezzar's life. That's how he's working in Daniel's life. And we live in a world that is filled with voices and filled with noise, and they're constantly shaping us. So we have to ask the question, which voices will we allow to disciple us? Which voices will we allow to shape how we view the world? Right? This, or for this service, mostly this, right? Or this. We get so much from the culture. There's noise all the time, and it doesn't matter whether I'm looking at news sources or whether I'm just looking at popular stuff. There are all kinds of things embedded in that that will take me away from what God is saying, right? Part of the story is driven forward by Nebuchadnezzar's preconceptions, and his intuitions are, he's the man, he's the king, he's the big guy, and God is saying, whoa, 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 I made you that. I gave you everything, and I can take you out, right? I'm the one. That didn't make sense to anyone until God revealed it. God has revealed himself, and part of that revelation should be editing me and how I view things and what I fill my life with, what I fill my mind with, and how much role his revelation has is a really critical question. If I'm going to thrive as one who lives in exile, I need to have something shaping my heart and mind that's actually true. I need to be careful about that. And then the last thing I would just encourage us with is this. God is doing this communication to be known, to invite them in. Inviting Nebuchadnezzar in too, right? To adjust himself. God's going to do some pretty harsh adjusting in chapter 4 especially. But he's working with him. Chapter 5, that emperor won't adjust, and so he gets judged. But God is working, God's revealing, because he's at work in the world and he's inviting us into it. He's inviting us into what he's doing. So a good approach to my daily life would be to ask a couple of questions to help line me up. One would be, where are you in this moment, God? Where are you in this moment or in this circumstance? This joyful circumstance, this terrifying circumstance, this reality that I'm facing right now, where are you? Not what are you doing? That's a good question to ask too. But it short circuits so easily the ability to just connect with God, to hear God, to see God. Because I can't always discern what he's doing, but I think for the most part, he'll show me himself. So where are you in this? And the second question is, what's your invitation for me? What are you inviting me into? Because he's not just communicating so that I will know something, right? In fact, this passage is filled with prophecy. One of the things I would encourage those that are really prophecy-oriented is look for God's invitation, not just information. If I do the latter, I'm really misreading it. What is God's invitation in that? God's inviting me into what he's doing. So, I don't know what's going on in your life right now. The world around us has got its craziness going. Your life may have similar or even more difficult craziness, maybe a great season. Whatever that season looks like, God wants you as his child, me as his child, to anchor in this reality. I know everything, and I'm working in everything. Anchor in me. I'm going to ask the ushers to come and I'll pray. Lord, I do ask for your grace that we would grow in our ability to just rest in you. I pray that you would strengthen us in faith and that we would see you, experience you. Lord, some of us are in really hard places. Would you meet us there? And Lord, would you work? Help us to see your invitation for us. In this moment, Lord, the invitation to worship you through our gifts, I pray that as we give, we would do so as worship and that you would use these gifts for the sake of your name. It's in that name we pray. Amen.